Hello and welcome back everybody. Today we're going to do real minimum requirement to play Monster Hunter Wilds beta. If you didn't remember, here's the list of what was the proposed minimum requirement. i5-10600 or i3-12100 or Ryzen 5 3600 with 16GB of memory, the GTX 1660 Super or the AMD Radeon RX 5600 XT. Welcome to Respawn PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. Keep in mind, this is still a beta. There's probably going to have some patch and update between now and the release date. We're going to start by dropping the CPU. So from the 10600 to the i5-9600K. Just to see the core count, because the i5-9600K is a 6-core 6-thread versus the 10600, which is a 6-core 12 threads. And for that test, we're going to stay with 16GB of memory and the GTX 1660 Super. Obviously, we're staying at 1080p, low settings, and FSR balance. That results in an average FPS of 43. It's highly playable. The GPU is pegged at 97 to 98% of utilization, using 4.5GB of VRAM out of 6, and the CPU is varying between 66% of utilization to 98% of utilization. The CPU is somehow a bottleneck here, depending on the situation. We're also almost a system memory bottleneck, using 15.2GB of system memory. So that means the system memory 16 is really the bare minimum. For the CPU, I think a 6-core 6-thread is not good enough. You can play, don't get me wrong, but that would be the limitation in the situation. This game seems to be core/thread dependent, because even the i3-12100F, which is a 4-core 8-thread, was able to play the game in the 40 to 50% of utilization. Next step, I dropped one generation of a CPU, the Intel i7-8700. This is a 6-core 12-thread CPU, like the i5-10600, and I dropped the GPU to the GTX 1650. This is a 4GB GPU, so we are 2GB of VRAM under the proposed minimum requirement. At 1080p, lower settings, FSR balance, the game is playable, but we have quite an issue. Everything is like missing some polygon to every object and assets in the game. And even if the frame time is quite smooth, we only have 23 FPS. Yes, the GPU is pegged at 99% and using the entire VRAM of the card, meaning 4GB, but the GPU side, we're using 40 to 50% of utilization, which is perfect. And I think we are also system memory bottleneck, using 15.9GB of system memory. I think the 2GB of VRAM missing is what making the system quite unplayable, where all the remaining polygon is loaded in the remaining 2GB of VRAM out of 6. Then what about the GTX 1080? This has more than 6GB of VRAM and it's obviously more powerful than the 1660 Super, but there's a little issue. You can see the name of other player, I guess, but that stay there. It's a black screen. I think we have an issue similar to Alan Wake 2, where the 1660 was the minimum because it supports some kind of a mesh shader. So maybe there's a shader story behind having the 1660 as the minimum requirement. I don't know which kind of shader or whatever technology is not there, because the RX 5600 XT was not able to play Alan Wake 2, but it's actually the minimum requirement for Monster Hunter. It's the same story with the GTX 1060 6GB variant. Everything is working fine, but there's nothing to see. The menu is working, can see other players' avatar name, and that's it. Let's stop there. Since the GTX 1660 seems to be the lowest card you can go, we can at least try to find out the lowest CPU. Now it's the i7-5920K. This chip is also a 6-core 12-thread CPU and is offering an average utilization in the high 60s. So we're still not bottlenecking the CPU. The GPU is at 97%, using 5.55GB of VRAM, and our system memory at 15.4. We are bottlenecked by the system memory again. So I guess with more system memory, the frame rate will be way higher. We're still at 45 FPS. And dropping to the next i7, the 4771. No, I don't have the i7-4770K, but between both CPU, there's absolutely no difference. This is now a 4-core 8-thread CPU instead of a 612. We're starting to see the limit of the CPU. We quite high in the high 70 to the mid 80, sometimes sometimes hitting in the 90% of utilization, and it shows a little bit time to times with the GPU. Sometimes going down to the 80% of utilization instead of being pegged at 98% of utilization. It shows in the FPS because now we drop to 41 FPS. Still on the i7-4771, I'm back with the GTX1660, the card that was giving a black screen when it's lower than the GTX1660. While waiting for the shader compilation, I was reading a bit and I found out that someone figured out why the GTX 10, 9 or whatever series don't display picture. You need to put the FSR to native to be able to see picture. But at 1080p, lowest settings and FSR native, even though the GPU is pegged at 99% and using 5.3 GB of VRAM, we get only a 23 FPS average, a meager 23 FPS. When you're lucky in some scene, you reach 29. And even if you drop the resolution to 720p, won't change much. You're going to have a 29 FPS average instead. It is not playable and it's horrible. And I'm just wandering in the world, not even fighting big monster or a huge group of monster. It's quite sad to see one of the best GPU of Nvidia that ever came out, the 1080 or 1080 Ti, is on its last leg to play a AAA game now. Dropping the CPU once more, the i7-3770, that is the limit you can go, because just starting the game make the launcher crash. You don't get any error message, you just get crash report, loading report, and that's all. So our minimum CPU will be the i7-4771. Now let's jump to the AMD side of things. So instead of the Ryzen 5 3600, 6-core 12-thread, it's still in the same generation, Ryzen 3, but 3100. This is a 4-core 8-thread, which I think should be the minimum to play this game. 4-core 8-thread. 6-core is a bit a limit, but playable, but you want to be safe, 4-core 8-thread. And for this Ryzen 3 3100, 4-core 8-thread is the limit also. The CPU is in the i80 to mid-90s, so probably the CPU is going to bottleneck here and there during gameplay, because the GPU also time to times go below 80% of utilization. Yes, the GPU is higher than the RX 5600 XT, but I don't have that card, so the closest I have is the RX 5700, and I wanted to test the core/thread of Ryzen, like the Intel one. And with that combination, with 16 GB of memory at 1080p, lowest settings, FSR balance, we get an average of 38 FPS. Time to drop my lowest 4-core 8-thread Ryzen CPU, the Ryzen 5 1500X. And let's drop the GPU also to the RX 5500 XT. I have the 8 GB variant, always at 1080p, lowest settings and FSR balance. We get an average of 31 FPS, but we are CPU bottleneck. It's always in the mid-90s, so there's probably some core that is pegged at 100% all the time. Even though the GPU is mid-90s to peg at 100% also, we are CPU bottlenecked. So the GPU can definitely handle it, but not the CPU. It is playable to some extent, but we encounter quite often big stutter, like a pause of almost 1 second. And then, just for the fun of it, I've tried the RX 590. This is also an 8 GB card. Even though it's quite old, it's still more powerful on paper than the RX 5500 XT. But like the GTX 1080, it's underperforming. We get an average of 15 FPS with that card. Unplayable. So unplayable that the CPU is not even a bottleneck anymore, because we're still using the R5 Ryzen 5 1500X. Now, because the dev didn't list any Intel GPU, I'm going to find out which one is. This is footage from my upcoming video with Monster Hunter Wild with Intel GPU, but here's the two cards I have, the A310, which will perform horribly for this test. It was with my i5 12600K, 32 GB of memory at 1080p or 720p, the lowest setting possible, every variant of XeSS from native to ultra performance. We were able to average only 15 to 26 FPS, and the card is only 4 GB of VRAM, and it was going to fetch some of the system memory to be able to compensate, and we're using 25 GB out of 32 GB of RAM. And on top of that, everything is polygon shape. The Intel A380 was giving a similar result as the A310, but this card is a 6 GB of VRAM, so besides having the same FPS and performance, at least at this time we're not in a polygon world. Everything seems to be in shape. I won't go too far in the Arc GPU. You have to wait for my Monster Hunter Wild Intel Arc GPU performance video. And finally, the card you will be able to play Monster Hunter Wild is the A580, the lowest Intel GPU can go. We get an average of 38 FPS at medium settings with XESS balance. Yes, I tested with the i5-12600K. I was actually testing the GPU, not the rest of the hardware. So we're not a CPU bottleneck. The GPU itself is back at 99%, using 6.7 GB of VRAM out of 8, but we're using 24.7 GB of RAM. The system memory is insanely high. Maybe with a 16 GB of memory, I'm going to be a bit more CPU high, but the game, the beta is closed, so no way for me to test anything else. But at least we know our winner. For the NVIDIA is the GTX1660 Super. For AMD it will be the RX 5500 XT 8 GB variant, not the 4. For Intel is the A580. In terms of CPU, Intel i7 4771 or 4770K. For AMD will be the Ryzen 5 1500X or the Ryzen 3 3100 or anything in between that have 4-core 8-thread or more. I hope that video helped a lot of people to get their PC ready when the game actually release. If you have some question, just comment below. I'll try to answer as best as I can, but I cannot do any other test because the beta is closed. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one. And subscribe.